10:42 a.m. on July 14, 1944, First Lieutenant Ebold Swanson was seated in the cockpit of a B-17G Flying Fortress nicknamed Mispa, observing black clouds of flak detonating across the skies above Budapest. At 24 years old, with 17 combat missions completed, there was zero margin for error. The Luftwaffe had positioned over 288mm anti-aircraft guns around the railway yards below, all actively firing. Swanson's B-17 was part of a 60-aircraft formation from the 483rd Bomb Group operating out of Sturparone, Italy. The mission appeared straightforward on paper: strike the Shell oil refinery and the railway yards in the heart of German-occupied Budapest, disrupt the supply lines feeding the Eastern Front, and return home. Yet by July 1944, bomber crews in the 15th Air Force were painfully aware of the statistics. Of every 10 men boarding a B-17, 8 would not return, some would die, some would be captured, some would simply vanish. The formation pushed onward through the flak curtain. Shells exploded in black puffs capable of shredding aluminum like paper. Mispa took hits in the tail and then the wings. Shrapnel tore holes through the fuselage, yet the bomber held its place in formation. Behind Swanson, the crew maintained their positions. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt occupied the co-pilot seat. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Dudley manned the bombardier station in the nose. Second Lieutenant Joe Henderson navigated from the compartment beside him. 8 additional men were stationed throughout the aircraft: radio operators, gunners, the flight engineer. Seconds from the target, Dudley released the bomb load. 2 tons of high explosives plummeted toward the railway yards below. The B-17 lurched upward as the weight dropped away. Then an 88mm shell struck the nose. The explosion was instantaneous. The entire forward section of Mispa was obliterated: the nose compartment, the bombardier station, the navigator's post, the Norden bombsight, the plexiglass panels. Everything ahead of the cockpit ceased to exist. Dudley and Henderson died instantly. The blast wave tore through what remained. The metal structure that had housed 2 men and thousands of pounds of equipment was gone. The aircraft's center of gravity shifted backward. With no weight in the nose, Mispa pitched into a near-vertical climb, beginning to stall. Swanson could see sky where instruments should have been. Bitter air at 30,000 feet screamed through the open cavity, with the temperature 40 degrees below zero. Wind shredded his flight suit. Blood from the explosion coated the flight deck. Through the gap where the nose had been, Swanson could still see the formation continuing toward the rally point. There was no control column. The yoke that connected to the flight control system had been mounted to the destroyed forward structure. The instruments were gone, the panel had been attached to the nose. Swanson had no airspeed indicator, no altimeter, no artificial horizon, no method to gauge the aircraft's behavior except by feel and by scanning the horizon through the massive hole before him. Yet the control cables remained, steel cables running from the cockpit back through the fuselage to the rudder, elevators, and ailerons. They hung exposed in the wind but remained intact. Swanson forced the B-17's nose down. He did not know how. There was nothing to push or pull. Yet somehow, he leveled the aircraft, guiding it back into loose formation with the group. The bomber should have been uncontrollable. Boeing engineers had designed the B-17 with inherent stability, but no engineer could have planned for this. No manual existed for flying without a cockpit. Physics and sheer desperation kept Mispa aloft. Behind him, the surviving crew began moving forward, the radio operator and flight engineer. They could see the exposed cables stretching through the bomb bay, feeling the wind tearing through the aircraft. They understood what had to happen. Over 200 flak guns were still firing. The formation remained over enemy territory, and another shell was about to strike engine number 2. 44 a.m., the second 88mm shell struck the right cyclone radial engine, exploding in a spray of oil and metal fragments. Flames streamed along the inboard nacelle of the left wing. The propeller windmilled for 3 seconds before seizing. Engine number 2 was dead. Mispa now had 3 engines instead of 4, losing airspeed as the formation pulled ahead. Without cockpit instruments, Swanson could not gauge how fast they were falling behind. Technical Sergeant Frank Menzie, the flight engineer, moved forward from the top turret. He immediately saw the problem: the control cables running through the fuselage in bundles, elevator, rudder, and aileron cables, steel wire rope about 3/8 inch thick. Normally enclosed in pulleys and hidden behind panels, they were now fully exposed, buffeted by the wind. Without someone holding them steady, the aircraft would become uncontrollable. Staff Sergeant George Semelli moved up from the radio compartment. Staff Sergeant Robert Bell came forward from the waist gun position. They stationed themselves near the bomb bay where the main cables were visible. There was no discussion, the solution was obvious. Someone had to hold and pull these cables as Swanson required control input. Coordination was the challenge. Swanson remained in the remnants of the cockpit 40 feet forward while the crew operated in the bomb bay. The intercom system was damaged, making communication nearly impossible. Swanson tried the rudder pedals. Nothing happened. They were still attached to the floor, but the cables they normally actuated were buffeted by 300 miles per hour winds. He tried the throttles, engines 1, 3, and 4 responded. But without control of the flight surfaces, the B-17 would eventually spiral out of formation or pitch up, stall, and spin. Either way, everyone would die. The crew began pulling, wrapping sections of cable around their hands for grip. The steel was frigid, cutting through gloves. When they pulled left on the rudder cable, Mispa's nose moved left. When they pulled right, it moved right. The elevators worked the same way. Pull back, the nose came up. Release, it dropped. The problem was that every input had to be perfectly timed. Too much pressure and the aircraft would over-respond. Too little, and nothing would happen. And they were doing this without seeing what Swanson was seeing, without knowing what corrections he needed, without instruments or indicators. MSPA continued falling behind the formation. The other B-7s were maintaining their cruise speed, heading southwest toward the Adriatic. Swanson's bomber was slower. Now, the drag from the missing nose section was enormous. The destroyed engine meant less power, and the formation was not waiting. They could not wait. Every minute over Hungary meant more exposure to fighters and flak. The standard procedure was clear. Aircraft that could not maintain formation speed were left behind. By 9:46 a.m., MSPO was alone. The formation was a mile ahead, then 2 miles. Swanson could see them in the distance, a cluster of dark shapes against the summer sky. His own aircraft was losing altitude. Not quickly, but steadily. They had been at 30,000 foot over the target. Now they were at 29,000. Then 28. The crew kept pulling cables. Their hands were cramping. The cold was brutal. Blood circulation was being cut off by the pressure of the steel against their palms. But they kept pulling. The fuel situation was unknown. The gauges were gone with the instrument panel. Swanson had no idea how much gasoline remained in the wing tanks. He had no idea how long 3 engines could keep them airborne. He had no idea if they were even heading in the right direction. Navigation required instruments. It required a map. It required the navigator, who was now dead somewhere over Budapest. All Swanson knew was southwest. Fly southwest. Get out of Hungary. Get over Yugoslavia. Get to the Adriatic. Get to Italy. Get home. Then the crew in the bomb bay started waving frantically toward the rear of the aircraft. Swanson could not turn around to look. The wind pressure through the open nose cavity made any movement dangerous. If he unbuckled from the pilot seat, he could be pulled forward and out of the aircraft. He stayed locked in position, watching the horizon, trying to keep the wings level. But the crew kept waving. Something was wrong in the rear section. Something beyond the missing nose, beyond the dead engine, beyond the exposed control cables. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker, the tail gunner, had been in his position when the nose exploded. The tail section was the most isolated spot on AB-17, a small compartment at the very back of the fuselage, accessible only by crawling through the waist gun area on hands and knees. Tucker had felt the impact. He had felt the aircraft pitch up violently. He had felt it stabilize, but now he was feeling something else. The tail structure was flexing. The metal framework that held the vertical stabilizer and horizontal stabilizers was moving in ways it should not move. The explosion had created stress fractures somewhere in the fuselage, or shrapnel had weakened critical support members. Either way, the tail section was beginning to fail. If the tail came off, everyone would die instantly. AB-7 without a tail would enter an unrecoverable spin. The aircraft would tumble end over end until it disintegrated or hit the ground. There would be no time to bail out, no time to react. The crew in the bomb bay understood this. They could see the tail gunner's position through the fuselage. They could see the structure moving, and they had no way to fix it. MSPA was now at 26,000 feet, still descending, still heading southwest. Swanson estimated they had been flying without a cockpit for 4 minutes, maybe 5. Every second felt like an hour. The wind noise was deafening. The cold was penetrating every layer of his flight suit. His hands on the throttles were going numb, but the throttles were the only controls he had left. Engine power was the only thing he could adjust without help from the crew pulling cables in the bomb bay. Second Lieutenant Paul Berndt, the co-pilot, was still in his seat. His control column was gone, too. His instruments were gone, but he was
Watching the wings, watching the engines, watching for fighters. German
Mesed 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s hunted lone bombers.
A damaged B-7 separated from its formation was an easy target. No defensive firepower from neighboring
aircraft, no mutual support, just one crippled bomber losing altitude over
enemy territory. But so far no fighters appeared. The Luftwaffe was either engaged elsewhere or had not spotted MSPA yet. The crew kept pulling cables. Their coordination was improving. When Swanson throttled back engine number 1, the aircraft wanted to yaw right. The crew compensated by pulling left rudder cable. When he increased power on engine number 4, they adjusted again.
It was not flying, it was collective survival through brute force.
10 men working as a single organism to keep
65,000 pounds of aluminum and steel in the air. At 9:50 a.m., Mispa crossed the
Hungarian border into Yugoslavia. Swanson did not know this. He had no map, no landmarks he could identify.
Through the gaping hole where his cockpit used to be, but the flak stopped.
The black clouds of explosions ceased.
That meant they were out of the heaviest defensive zones.
That meant they might have a chance. A small chance.
A chance that depended entirely on how long the tail structure would hold together.
How long the crew could keep pulling cables. How long 3 engines could generate enough thrust.
The fuel gauges were gone, but Swanson
could hear the engines. He could feel their vibration through the airframe. They were running smoothly. That meant fuel was still flowing. That meant the wing tanks were not empty yet. But how much remained was impossible to know.
B-7s carry 2,800 gal of aviation gasoline spread across multiple tanks.
At cruise power, 4 engines burned roughly 200 gal/hour.
But they were not at cruise power, they were at maximum continuous
power on 3 engines trying to maintain altitude and airspeed. That meant fuel consumption was higher, much higher. Swanson made a decision. The decision was simple. Get the crew out.
The aircraft was dying. The tail structure was failing. The fuel supply was unknown. They were still over
occupied territory.
Every minute in the air increased the risk of total structural failure.
If MSPA broke apart at altitude, no one would survive.
But if the crew could bail out while the aircraft was still controllable, most of
them would have a chance. They would be captured.
They would spend months in prisoner of war camps, but they would be
alive. The problem was execution.
Bailing out of a B-7 required coordination.
The standard procedure involved specific exit points.
The bombardier and navigator used the forward escape hatch in the nose, but that hatch
no longer existed.
The radio operator and others used the waist gun windows or the rear door.
The ball turret gunner
had to rotate his turret to a specific position before climbing out. Each crew member had practiced this dozens of
times in training, but training assumed the aircraft was intact.
Training assumed the pilot could communicate over
the intercom.
Training assumed there was time to organize an orderly evacuation.
Swanson had none of those things. He had no intercom.
He had no way to give the order. He had no way to coordinate who went first and who went last.
And he could not leave his position.
The moment he unbuckled, the moment he tried to move toward an exit, the aircraft would
become uncontrollable. The crew in the bomb bay would lose any reference for which cables to pull. The B-7 would enter a dive or a spin within seconds.
Everyone still aboard would die.
At 9:52
a.m., MSPA was at 24,000 feet. They had been flying without a cockpit for 10 minutes.
Swanson's hands were locked on the throttles.
His feet were on the rudder pedals, even though the pedals did nothing without the crew pulling.
Cables 30 foot behind him. Burns sat motionless in the co-pilot seat, watching the horizon, watching the wings, watching for any sign of catastrophic failure. Neither man spoke. There was nothing to say.
The wind noise made conversation impossible anyway.
The crew in the bomb bay made the decision themselves.
They could feel the tail structure flexing. They could see the stress cracks spreading through the
fuselage skin.
They understood that staying aboard meant dying when the aircraft came apart.
One by one, they
began moving toward the waist gun windows.
Staff Sergeant Robert Bell went first. He clipped his parachute harness,
positioned himself at the window opening, and jumped.
The slipstream took him instantly. Staff Sergeant Charles Kelly went next. Then Staff Sergeant George Semelli, then Technical Sergeant Frank Mency. Each time a man jumped, the aircraft became harder to control. Fewer hands on the cables meant less precise inputs. The B-7 began wallowing. The wings dipped left, then right. The nose pitched up slightly. Swanson adjusted throttle settings to compensate, but throttle alone was not enough. He needed the rudder. He needed the elevators. He needed the crew pulling cables, but the crew was abandoning ship. They had to. It was the only rational choice. Staff Sergeant Charles Tucker crawled forward from the tail gunner position. He squeezed through the narrow passage, emerged in the waist gun area, and saw the empty positions where his crewmates had been standing moments before. He saw the exposed control cables now slack without hands holding them. He saw the massive opening where the nose used to be 40 feet forward. He clipped on his parachute and jumped. By 9:54 a.m., 5 men had evacuated. 5 men were descending under parachute canopies over Yugoslavia. 5 men would be captured by German forces within hours, but 5 men would survive the day. That left 5 men still aboard MSPA, Swanson in the pilot seat, burnt in the co-pilot seat, and 3 others who had not yet reached the exit points. The aircraft was at 22,000 feet, still descending, still barely controllable, and the tail structure was about to fail completely. The remaining crew members moved toward the exits. Staff Sergeant Paul Hish, waist gunner, went through the window opening, his parachute deployed cleanly. Staff Sergeant Robert Tucker, another waist gunner, followed seconds later. That left 3 men aboard, Swanson, burnt, and 1 more crew member still making his way forward from a rear position. The aircraft was becoming increasingly unstable, with almost no one pulling the control cables. MSPA was responding only to engine power and inherent aerodynamic stability. That stability was designed for normal flight conditions, not for flight without a nose section, not for flight with a failing tail structure. 56 a.m., the last crew member reached the waist gun area, jumped, and disappeared into the slipstream. Swanson and Burnt were alone. 2 men in the remains of a B-7 flying fortress at 20,000 foot over Yugoslavia. The bomber was still descending. 3 engines were still running, but the aircraft was no longer truly flyable. It was barely staying in the air through a combination of residual stability and the fact that the wings were still generating lift. Without crew members pulling cables, any significant control input was impossible. Swanson turned his head slightly and made eye contact with Burnt. No words were exchanged. The wind noise would have drowned out any conversation, but the message was clear. Burnt needed to go. There was no reason for the co-pilot to stay aboard. He had no controls. He had no function. If he stayed, he would die when the aircraft finally broke apart or crashed. The only rational choice was to bail out while altitude remained, while there was still time to deploy a parachute and survive the landing. Burnt unbuckled his harness. He stood up from the co-pilot seat. He moved carefully toward the rear of the flight deck where he could access the main fuselage and reached the waist gun exit. He looked back at Swanson one final time. The pilot was still locked in position, hands on throttles, eyes forward, holding the dying aircraft as steady as possible. Burnt climbed through the crawlway behind the cockpit and headed aft. 30 seconds later, he jumped. Ewald Swanson was alone, 1 man in his 65,000 pounds bomber at 19,000 feet. The aircraft was falling at approximately 200 feet per minute. Not a dive, just a steady descent. The 3 remaining engines were producing enough thrust to maintain forward speed, but not enough to hold altitude. The missing nose created massive drag. The aerodynamic profile was destroyed. The B-7 was essentially a flying brick with wings. The fuel situation remained unknown. The wing tanks could be nearly full or nearly empty. There was no way to tell. The engine sound gave no indication. Right. Cyclone engines ran smoothly until the fuel supply was completely exhausted, at which point they simply stopped. No warning, no sputtering, just silence. And if all 3 engines quit simultaneously, MSPA would drop out of the sky. Swanson estimated his position. They had been flying southwest for approximately 14 minutes since leaving Budapest. Airspeed was probably around 180 miles per hour, maybe less.
That meant they had covered roughly 40 m, maybe 45.
The border between Hungary and Yugoslavia was approximately 30 miles from Budapest. That meant they were likely over Yugoslavia now, possibly approaching the mountains, possibly approaching the Adriatic coast. But all of this was guesswork.
Without instruments, without maps, without a navigator, he was flying
blind.
The question was how long to stay aboard.
Every minute at the controls
meant the crew below had more time to distance themselves from the crash site.
German patrols would search for a down bomber. But if Swanson could keep Mizpah flying for another few minutes, the crew members under parachutes would land
miles away from where the aircraft eventually hit the ground.
That separation could mean the difference between capture and evasion, between imprisonment and freedom. But staying aboard also meant increased risk of dying in the crash.
The tail structure was still flexing.
The bomber could break apart at any moment.
And when Swanson finally decided to bail out, he would have to unbuckle, stand up, move through the aircraft to an exit point, and jump.
All while the B-7 was uncontrolled. All while it was potentially entering a death spiral.
At 9:58 a.m., Swanson made his final
decision.
He would stay with the aircraft for 2 more minutes.
That would give the crew more separation distance. That would give them a better chance. Then he would go. Swanson kept his hands on the throttles.
The 3 Wright Cyclone engines continued their steady roar.
Engine number 1 on the far left wing. Engine number 3 inboard on the right wing. Engine number 4 on the far right wing. All running smoothly, all consuming fuel at an unknown rate. The
bomber descended through 18,000 feet at 10 a.m. exactly. Swanson released the
throttles.
He unbuckled his harness. The moment the straps came loose, he felt the wind pressure trying to pull him forward toward the massive opening where the nose used to be.
He pushed back
against his seat, then stood up carefully. The aircraft immediately began to pitch.
Without anyone
controlling the throttles, without anyone making corrections, MSPA started a gentle left roll.
Swanson moved
quickly toward the rear of the flight deck. He squeezed through the narrow crawlway that led to the bomb bay area. Behind him, the bomber's nose dropped.
The control cables hung loose in the bomb bay. Nobody was pulling them now. Nobody was holding the aircraft steady. Swanson could feel the B-17 accelerating into a dive.
He had maybe 30 seconds before the angle became too steep before
the G-forces made movement impossible before the aircraft entered a spin. He reached the waist gun area. The aluminum floor was vibrating under his boots.
The wind noise was overwhelming.
He grabbed
his parachute pack from the storage rack, clipped it to his harness, and moved toward the window opening.
The
bomber was diving now, not vertically, but steeply enough that Swanson had to brace himself against the fuselage to
stay upright.
He positioned himself at the waist gun window, looked out at the Yugoslav countryside 17,000 feet below,
and jumped.
The slipstream hit him like a physical wall. The wind spun him
sideways.
The B-7 flashed past, engine still roaring, already 200 feet away and
accelerating downward. Swanson pulled the ripcord.
The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that knocked the wind from his lungs.
Then silence, relative silence. The roar of the engines faded as MSPA continued its dive. Swanson watched the bomber fall.
The tail section was still attached, but barely. The entire rear fuselage was flexing like a reed in the wind.
At 15,000 feet, the tail separated. The B-17's forward section pitched nose down almost
vertically. It fell for another 8 seconds, then disappeared into a line of trees 2 miles away.
A column of black smoke rose moments later.
The fuel tanks had ignited on impact.
Nothing survived that crash. No one could have survived it. If Swanson had stayed aboard for another 30 seconds, he would be dead. The parachute descent was slow. Swanson drifted
southwest with the prevailing wind. Below him, the Yugoslav landscape showed scattered farms, forests, and small villages. Somewhere down there were German occupation forces.
Somewhere down
there were his crew members who had jumped minutes before him. Somewhere down there was the reality that his war
was over. He was about to become a prisoner. The ground came up faster than expected. Swanson could see trees.
He tried to steer the parachute toward an open field, but the canopy was not designed for precision maneuvering. The trees were directly below him now. He hit the upper branches at approximately 15 miles per hour. Branches snapped. The parachute canopy caught on limbs. Swanson crashed through the foliage and slammed into a thick branch with his left side. He felt his left leg break. The bone snapped cleanly somewhere between the knee and ankle. Pain exploded through his nervous system. He fell another 10 feet and came to a stop, tangled in parachute lines and broken branches 15 feet above the ground. Blood was running down his leg. His flight suit was torn. Deep lacerations covered his left thigh where branches had cut through fabric and skin. His left leg was bent at an unnatural angle. He could not move it, could not put weight on it, could not climb down from the tree. He hung there, suspended in the parachute harness, trying to control the pain, trying to stay conscious. Below him, he heard voices, German voices. German soldiers arrived at the base of the tree within minutes. They were Wehrmacht infantry, part of an occupation unit stationed in the area. They had seen the parachutes descending. They had heard the crash of the B-7. Now they were gathering American airmen. Swanson remained suspended in his harness, 15 feet above the ground, motionless and unable to move or escape. One of the soldiers called up to him, but Swanson did not respond. The soldiers began debating how to get him down. They located a ladder from a nearby farm. 2 men climbed up and cut the parachute lines, carefully lowering Swanson to avoid worsening his leg injury. Once on the ground, they laid him on his back in the dirt. A German medic arrived, assessing the broken leg, lacerations, and blood loss. He fashioned a temporary splint from wooden boards and cloth strips and administered morphine from a medical kit. The pain began to subside. Swanson felt the drug dull the sharp agony in his leg to a distant throb. The medic bandaged the deep cuts and checked for additional injuries. His ribs appeared intact, no head trauma, no detectable internal bleeding. The immediate concern remained the leg. Without proper treatment, infection could set in, and without surgery, the bone might not heal correctly. For now, the medic had done all he could with limited supplies in the forest clearing. The Germans transported Swanson to a local command post and then to a Wehrmacht medical facility. A German doctor examined the leg, confirmed the fracture, and properly set the bone. Despite the morphine, the procedure was painful, and Swanson lost consciousness twice. When he awoke, his leg was encased in a plaster cast from ankle to hip. Through an interpreter, the doctor explained the fracture was clean and would heal, but Swanson would not walk normally for months. Over the next 3 days, the rest of Mispa's crew was captured. All 8 men who had bailed out were found within a 20-meter radius of the crash site. None evaded capture. The Yugoslav countryside was heavily patrolled. Partisan resistance operated in the mountains, but the crew had landed in farmland under German control. One by one, they were brought to the same processing center. Swanson saw them arrive: Burnt, Menzi, Simonelli, Bell, Kelly, Tucker, Hish, all alive, all uninjured except for minor cuts and bruises, all now prisoners of war. They were sent to a prisoner of war camp in Austria, Stalag Luft 4, designated for captured Allied airmen. The camp housed roughly 10,000 American and British pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and flight engineers. Conditions were harsh, though not brutal. Food was limited, Red Cross parcels arrived irregularly, and barracks were cold in winter. Medical care was minimal. Yet the Germans generally adhered to Geneva Convention standards for officer prisoners. There were no mass executions, no systematic torture, only confinement, monotony, and waiting. Swanson's leg healed slowly. He spent the first 2 months on crutches, with the cast removed in September 1944. Physical therapy was basic. He walked around the camp perimeter daily to rebuild strength. By October, he could walk unaided. By November, the limp was barely noticeable. By December, he was physically recovered, but the war continued. The camp remained secured, with guards patrolling the wire. Escape attempts were rare and mostly unsuccessful. The crew of Mispa settled into the routine of captivity, recounting the mission: the 88mm shell, the 10 minutes without a cockpit, pulling control cables by hand, watching their bomber crash in the Yugoslav forest, and remembering Dudley and Henderson, who had died instantly. They waited for the war to end, for liberation, for home. Winter turned to spring. The Germans began evacuating camps as Soviet forces advanced from the east. Prisoners were marched westward in long columns, conditions worsening. Food became scarce. Some died, others escaped amid the chaos. Swanson and his crew remained together, marching through Germany as the Third Reich collapsed. On April 30, 1945, American forces reached their column, freeing them.
9 months of captivity ended on a dirt road in central Germany.
American tanks passed by, distributing food, water, and cigarettes.
Medical personnel assessed injuries and illness.
The former prisoners were transported to collection points, then airfields, then back to Italy, and eventually to the United States. The crew of Mispa returned home 8 survivors, all men who had pulled control cables by hand at 30,000 feet over Budapest, all who had jumped from a failing bomber and lived. Swanson returned to civilian life in Michigan, married, raised a family, and worked quietly for decades.
He rarely spoke of July 14, 1944.
When asked, he said only that he had been lucky, the crew had been lucky, and Dudley and Henderson had not. He did not see himself as a hero, only as a pilot who had done his duty under impossible circumstances. The Army Air Forces disagreed, promoting him over the years, eventually retiring as a lieutenant colonel. Recognition was for a career of service, though that one mission remained defining: the 10 minutes without a cockpit, the 10 minutes that should have killed everyone aboard. The crew maintained contact, attending 483rd Bomb Group reunions, gathering to remember the war, the missions, and the men who did not return. Their bond was unbreakable. They had survived the impossible, flying a bomber with no nose, no instruments, no cockpit, and exposed control cables in 300 miles per hour wind. They had done so through coordination, determination, and refusal to surrender. They honored Dudley and Henderson by surviving, ensuring their sacrifice mattered. Paul Berndt stayed near Swanson in Michigan, remaining friends until the end. Frank Menzi returned to his family, rarely discussing the war. George Simonelli preserved photographs from the mission, showing them to grandchildren decades later, explaining the peril of pulling steel cables while a bomber disintegrated. The others scattered across the U.S., but all remembered. Ewald Swanson died in 2009 at 89, having witnessed the world change, aircraft evolve, and spaceflight emerge.
Yet the aircraft he recalled most vividly was Mispa, the B-17G that lost its nose over Budapest, a bomber sustained by human will and determination.
If this story moved you, hit the like button. Every like helps share forgotten stories.
Subscribe and turn on notifications. We rescue stories of bomber crews who refused to quit when physics said they should. Real people, real heroism. Drop a comment and share where you're watching from. Thank you for helping keep Ewald Swanson and the crew of Mispa alive in memory. Kenneth Dudley and Joe Henderson died instantly when that 88mm shell struck. They were 23 and 24, never returning home.
The 8 survivors carried their memory forward for 9 months in a POW camp and for decades afterward in Michigan and across the U.S. Through this story, their names endure. They deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.